Welcome to another episode of the GayBarchives show, where we explore gay history, one bar at a time. I'm your host, Art Smith. Our guest today is the host of the Arizona Happy Hour, the hip historian himself, Marshall Shore. So welcome, Marshall.
I am so happy to be here. Thank you so much for asking me to be involved and participate.
Well, you are most welcome. I am so excited to find people around the country who are as enthusiastic about gay history as I am. And apparently, you've actually made more of a career out of being enthusiastic about history in general. Your nickname, the Hip Historian, is kind of a brand that follows you around. And as I understand it right now, you have a weekly live streaming show called Arizona Happy Hour, which talks about Arizona history and little trivia stuff.
Yeah, so I've been doing that actually with COVID starting. I mean, it's like as COVID was kicking in, everything I was doing got canceled, any live performances. So I was like, what else do I do? So I started doing this virtual happy hour. And so we've got over 100 episodes, and we've covered everything from small towns in Arizona. We've had drag queens on. So we cover all kinds of Arizona history.
Yeah, and I've watched some of those episodes, and they definitely are interesting. I mean, learn a lot of stuff about a lot of places. This project, too, really got kicked off with COVID because for the same reasons, so much of everything else, both professionally and personally, kind of dwindled. You didn't go out to restaurants as much. You didn't go out socializing at clubs or shopping at malls or whatever. And so I kind of dove into my project and started doing these interviews. You are actually interview number 90. So we've done 90 interviews with people talking about the gay bars from their past. Now, you are currently based in Phoenix, Arizona, but your history with the gay bar scene does not start there. So where does your gay bar history start?
So I basically came out in small town Indiana, not far from Purdue University. And so the first bar I remember going to was an old train depot in Lafayette, Indiana. And it was one of those bars where it was 2 floors. It was very much a community bar. The windows were all painted black. So that way, if some crackpot decided to take a shot, they couldn't see if there was someone at the window.
And that was a common thing in bars back in the 70s, 80s, even into the early 90s in a lot of places. That gay bars did not have windows that you could see through. They were painted black or heavy drape or.
Yeah, and so that was not unusual. And then it was like, so from small town Indiana, I then spent a lot of time going to Indianapolis and to some of the more, I would say, larger iconic clubs for Indiana. The 21 Club, Talbot Street, which was an old movie theater converted into a bar. It was interesting. I actually just went on I listened to a Zoom for the Indiana Geological Society was doing an LGBT kind of history, which was kind of fun. Basically, then from Indiana, I moved to the whole other spectrum of Hello, New York City. In the early 90s, kind of what is considered now to be the heyday of gay life in New York.
So while you were in Indianapolis, you mentioned a couple of bars there, the 21 and Talbot Street. What do you remember about those bars? What were they like?
I mean, they were, it's so interesting looking back in perspective and going when I was underage, using a really bad fake ID, but realizing later on that the bartenders actually were taking care of me. It's like the drinks would start being really strong to start off with, and then through the course of the night, I was probably just drinking water by the end because they knew I had a long drive home, and so they didn't. So, it was very much a caring community. It was also a diverse community, which I really appreciated. And you also then, oh gosh, and I think it's actually now on the Register of Historic Places, the local lesbian bar that was there, which I'm blanking on the name right now. But I mean, that was kind of for me, that was kind of my boat in the harbor. That was my place to go be me and to go meet other friends. I actually met one of my best friends there. And she is still in Indianapolis and still an amazing friend.
And that is true for so many of us. The gay bar scene back then was one of the few places that you could meet like-minded individuals. You could make friendships. You could talk about things that were troubling you or that you were curious about or whatever, because we didn't have social media. We didn't have tons of TV movies and TV shows that had gay characters. So we were kind of on our own.
Right. I mean, you can really kind of count those media things on one hand. I mean, you had like Early Frost, Making Love, Parting Glances. So, I mean, there weren't really a lot of even depictions of in the movies or Hollywood at that point that were positive.
And La Cage aux Folles. We cannot
forget. Yeah, Birds of a Feather. The original French version, not that redo American version. I'm not a fan of that. I prefer the subtitled version.
I do too. So you moved to New York City in the early 90s. And what kind of bar scene did you investigate there? Where did you go out when you went to New York City?
You know, I mean, at that point, there was a range of clubs. You had like little neighborhood bars. Kind of my home spot was a little place in the East Village called Barracuda. But you also had these, like the Roxy, which is an old roller rink, which I went to a couple times, but realized early on that was not what I wanted. Was just a huge crowd of folks that were so into the dancing that there was the option of talking was not even a possibility. I really wanted to go more to those neighborhood places where you could talk. I mean, that's what I was used to. So I wanted to hang out and chat with people. What was going on in their lives? What was going on in the world? So that's why I gravitated more to the smaller bars. And
there were quite a few of those, still are in New York City.
There are. I mean, then you had like the Splash, which friends, I mean, so I actually met my other half through a group called 20 something, which was an alternative to the bars. So not that we didn't drink, but it was trying to get away from kind of like the Palladium, the Roxy, where it was just that really big scene, again, to try and help educate, create conversation amongst a variety of people. And through that is actually where I met my partner, Paul, of now almost 29 years.
Wow. Now, did you personally ever experience the Palladium or just kind of heard about it from people around town?
You know, I think I went, it was like, I mean, the Roxy was the one that I went to more. I can honestly remember leaving the Roxy in tears because, and having to hop in a cab and book it back to Brooklyn just because I was so unhappy with just that mass of people, and I really needed a connection. I really wanted to chat with people, and it was so interesting at that point, really going home in tears from this, what many people would have been like, oh my gosh, that's an amazing club. And I was just like, that is not what coming from a small town, that's not what I wanted. I wanted that small town kind of feel, which New York had a lot of.
Yes, it did. And as I mentioned earlier, there were a ton of little hole in the wall bars. In fact, one bar in New York City that has been around possibly the longest of any gay bar in the city is Julia's. And that is certainly a tiny little bar. That's not.
Now, did Julius close down? I thought I'd heard
they're still operating.
Okay, good. Because I mean, that was kind of, it's like, you know, besides being able to go have a drink at the Stonewall, it's like Julius was a place where you could go hang out. And again, just sit at the bar and chat with people.
Yeah. Now the Stonewall, when you moved to New York in the early 90s, was the Stonewall open at that time?
It was. And so I can remember going there and just feeling extremely lucky to be able to have a drink in a place where gay civil rights kind of got their start. Not that it was.
You know, as a historian, that the Stonewall has not been in continuous existence.
Right.
It was closed for quite a while. I think it was the early 90s, like 91. It reopened after having been a Chinese restaurant. It reopened as a bar called New Jimmy's. And then a year or two later, they changed the name back to Stonewall. So,
okay.
But it had been several incarnations other than a gay bar. I think the original Stonewall that we all know for the riots actually closed like in 1970. It didn't stay open very much longer.
I'm not shocked at all.
Yeah, but things back then were different. You had a lot of political things going on. You had a lot of police activity hampering the operation of bars, gay bars. So there was a lot of things going on. But you had your taste of all these bars in New York, and from the little bitty hole in the walls that is gigantic.
Or places, or also like the Duplex. Which was more of a performance space. It was a bar on the first floor, and then upstairs it had like a small theater. And so that's where Charles Busch would do a lot of his things that wound up becoming like Beach Blanket Bingo, some of those Hollywood movies that he's been involved with. So that was always a fun place to go and just see a variety of musical acts. Oh my gosh. And I think also Marie's Crisis is still open. And so that is kind of a musical bar. I mean, I can remember going with friends, and you would wind up with these Hollywood folks who basically, not Hollywood, Broadway stars who would basically get out of a show and then show up there and continue singing. Or the bartender, oh gosh, his name was, God, I haven't thought of his name in Albert. And so he was this tall, heavy set guy, and he would drop into a perfect falsetto and do opera.
Wow.
And the place would come to a standstill. So a lot of Broadway types would also try out new material there. If they were working on a musical and they just wanted to get a reaction of an audience, they could come there and perform. And as far as I know, and I think Marie's Crisis is still packing them in.
I believe you are correct. So how long were you in New York?
I left New York just the tail end of 99. So I was there for almost a decade.
And how is it that you ended up in Phoenix?
Basically because we had a landlord that was kind of mafioso, and after there was a rat in the apartment, there was a fire in the apartment, their rent went up 20%. It was kind of, okay, we either need to make a commitment and buy something or move and have an adventure. And so Paul basically gave me a list of all the places he was willing to move to. On that list was places in Arizona. My parents had retired to Arizona a few years before that. So as an only child, I was like, well, then let's go hang out with my parents and have some good years before bad things befall. And I have no one to delegate to. So my parents basically were the reason why we moved to Arizona, and they are still in good health and having an amazing adventure here in Arizona, looking at a wide variety of histories, from LGBTQ history to neon history, Disney. I'm actually doing a program this weekend on Disney history in Arizona.
Wow. So you've been in Arizona for like almost 25 years.
22 years, actually. Yeah. Just a little over 22.
Very cool. So now, after having lived in basically nowhere, Indiana, and then going to Manhattan, to New York City, and being at the peak of the gay bar scene in the early 90s, throughout the entire decade, you then find yourself in Phoenix, Arizona. What was that? What was the change like? Did you find it to be quite different in Phoenix than you did in Manhattan?
Oh, very much so. I mean, it was very much, I mean, that transition um, across so many spaces. It was like, I mean, I moved from being a moderate to now being this leftist radical. Um, Going from, I mean, where you could walk out and see a show on any given night. I was now in a place where it's like, we'd be like, hey, you know, we have a show coming up in 3 months. Now, remember, we've got to go have dinner before the show because nothing else is open after the show.
Right.
I mean, luckily that has changed. Now we have lots of food options. I just saw a really good play, Raising an American Son, which was a gay themed original play that was done by one of the local theater companies here. That was really well done.
So what were some of the bars in Phoenix that you recall from when you first got there?
Oh, I mean, a lot of times what happens here is you have a building that kind of rotates names. There was Friends that then became Cherry Bar, that then became something else, and now has closed down altogether. You had Cell Block, which kind of did the same thing. You've got Charlie's, which is kind of the South country western bar. When we first got here, that is now kind of now changed a lot, and they don't do two-stepping nearly as much as they used to. We still do have one of the first gay rodeos that started was here in Arizona. So, I mean, it's kind of that Southwest, that cowboy feel is still around. There was Paco Paco, which was the Latino bar.
Was that so I've heard about Charlie's. I've stumbled across it a couple of times in my research, and Charlie's had like 3 or 4 locations. They were in Chicago, they were in Vegas,
right?
They were in Denver, and they had an affiliated bar in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, which was called Paco's Ranch.
Oh, wow.
Was Charlie's in any way connected with Paco's?
Not at all.
No.
I mean, this was a little homespun bar that, as an Anglo, they charged me $1 more for beer. And, you know, and it was such, I mean, it's like having been in New York and gone to like Escalita.
Oh, yeah.
Which was, I mean, was just a feast for so many senses. And then winding up at the Phoenix version of that, it was still really interesting because it was still really good people watching. I mean, you would see the old vaqueros walking by in their triple starch shirts that didn't move with the really huge belt buckles. I mean, and I can remember actually being in South Phoenix at one point near the rodeo and seeing a truck go by hauling a horse trailer that, you know, had, you know, the famous like Mud Flat Girl. This had Mud Flat Boys on it.
Oh, wow.
I was like, and so it was just kind of those like, wow, okay. So, you know, I mean, it's been an interesting adventure coming to Arizona. And some of those same things that were going on, the harassment in New York, LA, San Francisco, that was happening across the country. And finding that here with even, there was a gay social club, not even a bar, but it was just a coffee house that had dancing. And I've got a friend who wound up being arrested, and his name was published in the paper. His life was forever changed. He had a degree in teaching from ASU that now, because he was an out homosexual in the early 60s, that was not going to be an option.
So Charlie's is still in existence there, correct?
It is indeed. I don't know if the one in... There was also one, I think, in New York as well. I think it was Uncle Charlie's in New York.
Yeah, that wasn't related, I don't think.
Okay, it wasn't really... Okay, I never knew if it was related or not, so...
There were several, 2 or 3 Uncle Charlie's in Manhattan, and they also had one in Miami and one maybe in Fort Lauderdale. They had several of them along the East Coast. But...
Now, we did here so we had a little bar called the 307, which was, the address was actually 222 East Roosevelt. And that at one point was Little Jim's, and they also had a bar in Chicago as well.
Yeah, the one in Chicago just closed recently. For many,
Oh,
many years. They were there for decades.
and
And
then we also have here in Scottsdale, we have BS West, which was, from my understanding, they had a bar in New York called Breadsticks. And so this was their Western outpost. So it became Breadsticks West, or now just BS West. And that is still a thriving bar to this day.
so that's where the name BS comes from, breadsticks.
Yeah, from a bar that I'd never heard of in New York. And I don't even know if it was New York City or someplace else in New York.
Wow, that is pretty cool.
So it may have been, one of those myriad of small towns that had like Syracuse or something. I don't know. So I've never been able to find any more about Breadsticks, the bar. And then it's interesting, like it's like if you look in the Dameron guide, I mean, at one point that used to be like the Bible of where to go for gay places, because you didn't have access to online sources. But now, kind of looking back at some of those as a historian, it was kind of like sometimes a place would be listed even though it wasn't gay. Like somebody may have had an experience there, but it wasn't usually a gay place.
Yeah, I've run across that a number of times where, in fact, I was just speaking to a historian out of Chicago. I don't know if you're familiar with Rick Carlin or not, but Rick Carlin was a gay journalist in Chicago for 30 or 40 years. And he and St. Suki Delacroix just sent off their newest book to the publishers, which is about the history of gay friendly and gay accepting establishments in Chicago. It'll be out, I think, in September.
Oh, cool.
But they documented 1,001 places in the city of Chicago. The book is called Last Call Chicago, A History of 1,001 LGBTQ friendly taverns, haunts, and hangouts. And in so many places, when you go back in history to around the time of World War II and up into the 70s, a lot of places didn't specifically advertise as or publicly identify as gay bars. It was kind of an evolutionary process, or they were bohemian spaces that allowed gay men, and predominantly gay men, to hang out and maybe show some signs of affections and express their personality more genuinely than they could in other places. But I don't think they weren't, of course, waving the rainbow flag that did not yet exist outside their stores or their businesses.
Right. And that was a lot here. Yeah. I mean, it was like we did a bar owner panel several years ago. And at that point, they created a list of bars that were, I think they came with like 124 bars. And we think that's actually close to like 180 bars that have been around since the 40s.
And that's where?
In Phoenix.
In Phoenix. So another example, obviously, 180 bars in a town the size of Phoenix, a city the size of Phoenix. That tells you, when you multiply that by how many other cities there are of that size around the country, how many thousands of bars there were. I mean, there were quite a few. I've only documented so far a couple thousand across the country. And I know it's just the tip of the iceberg. It's just really difficult finding the information sometimes, particularly from a distance.
Right. And also, I mean, it's like you don't really start having one was really the first press that was really by the LGBT community for the LGBT community. I mean, here in Arizona, we didn't have that till the mid 70s. And so pretty much anything else is almost oral histories, word of mouth. We did a project several years ago. We interviewed folks that were here in the 50s, and they all said, oh, there are only two LGBTQ bars here, but they each mentioned two different bars. So they didn't even realize that there were a handful of other places The first bar that we can place in the Valley, that we can put in print, there may have been other bars that we can't distinguish yet. Not to say we're not going to find more information, but I think it was a lesbian bar that opened up in the early 40s, and that was Kay's Happy Landing Buffet.
I have heard of that.
And so that was Kay Elledge and her girlfriend Violet. And so from my understanding, basically the bar opened up because Violet's husband had been killed in the war, and the insurance money was then used to open up the bar. And it was just a little tiny space. Kay had trouble even sometimes getting booze because she was a woman. But I think one of the interesting things was there is a fairly famous drag queen like the 30s and 40s named Ray Bourbon. And so Kay at one point had been a musician in Ray's band. And so he would perform there quite often. And from what I've gathered, it wasn't a very big space. You had to go up a very narrow flight of stairs that were quite steep to this little hot box of a space. Sadly, out of the two locations where Kay's Happy Landing Buffet was, neither of those buildings exist.
Is that because the neighborhood's gentrified, or?
I think just because gentrification, but also it was probably an old rickety building that probably just had outlasted its time. I think it was 2014, 2015 here when I talk about the 307. That's really what kind of cauterized and helped form a group that is now called the Arizona LGBT plus History Project. And the building still stood. It was also famous for an Arizona artist who had done murals, because back when it was I don't want to say just a bar, back before it was a drag bar, which it became in the early 70s, it was on a very heavy cruise circuit. And so we know it did have an element of folks who were hanging out there just because of where it was. It was an area that later became known as the Fruit Loop. And the 307, and that was little gyms. It had a variety of, it was always kept as the 307, which was its original address. But the 307, that's when I say it was at 222, caused a little bit of issue because it wasn't the address. But I think a lot of it was because there was no way to publish, hey, your favorite bar is now moving across the street. So that's why they kept the same numbers.
Right.
When that building was being torn down, we tried to save it. And sadly, that didn't happen. Luckily, there is now a plaque inset in the sidewalk commemorating the 307 and those artist murals that were there. So it commemorates the fact that it was an LGBTQ friendly space from, I think we say the early 50s, because we don't really know. It was then purchased in, I think, 1970 by a guy, and that's when it became a very friendly to drag and very heavy in drag performance. And it was such a tiny bar, there was no space for the drag queens to get dressed. So the building had a small space across the alley that then became called the dressing room. And so the drag queens and performers would get dressed there and have to burst through the side door across the alley and then into the door of the 307.
Well, I was just looking up the information that I had uncovered about Kay's Happy Landing Buffet. And you're right. They had two locations, both on South Central Avenue.
Right. Which are very different. Right. I mean, which it's now, if you know South Phoenix at all, it's kind of shocking there would be a lesbian bar there. But I've got one woman on Facebook that I'll post things across various kind of history websites. And she's like, even when I was pregnant, I would go deliver there. And because I was a young woman who was pregnant, they would tip me really well just for delivering their booze, because they were so happy to support another woman, but also happy they were getting their booze.
Right. Well, I stumbled across some information that I thought was kind of unusual when I was researching the bars over there. According to the research I did, that bar opened in 1941.
Right.
So, I mean, we're talking about a long time ago. Now, 80 years.
Okay.
Right. And then it continued to operate for about 25 years in that same little strip there. But the one thing that I thought was kind of a peculiar little tidbit, you probably already knew this, the name for the bar came from a movie of the same name. Happy Landing was a musical ice skating comedy that starred Sonia Henney and Don Amici in 1938. And that's where the name came from. So it was named after a movie.
But I still think, just kind of, if you take it tongue in cheek, what a great name for a lesbian bar, especially the fact that it was a buffet.
Absolutely. And there's a website blog that specializes in information about lesbian bars and women's bars called the Lost Women's Spaces blog. And they make the same exact statement. In their listing of it, they say, what's the best name for a lesbian bar ever? Kay's Happy Landing Buffet, of course.
Indeed.
So yeah, it's quite a quirky little name and a quirky little history for something that existed, like I said, 80 years ago.
Right.
So, we're talking about a long time. And not somewhere in a big city. I mean, we found some older bars that are in, New York City or San Francisco, but to be in Phoenix, that was pretty revolutionary.
Well, and then we also had places here like the South Seas, which was a businessman's lunch place downtown that at night got a little loose. And so it was essentially a gay bar in the evenings.
Yeah, and I've seen a number of those in the course of my research where, very often, a restaurant in a hotel would have, a men's dining room that was basically a gay bar. Some of the first gay bars in some big cities, like I think Milwaukee is one of them. Some of their first gay bars were actually restaurants in hotels downtown that somehow evolved into catering to single men or men only without having any female accompaniment. So it was an interesting evolution of how we've gotten into the gay bar scene. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you have kind of branded yourself as the hip historian. And we can tell just even looking at you with the little kind of whimsical ice cream twist at the bottom of your beard, and you've got kind of a funky vibe going on there. But your project, the Hip Historian Project, mostly focuses on general history from Arizona. But you have done some specific segments on gay history as well, correct?
Oh, correct. I mean, that's, for me, it's all about telling a story. I mean, and we've done a variety of marginalized communities. It's like when people think about Arizona, the Black migration for cotton is quite well documented here. But then we had one woman on talking about the Black migration of lumber to Arizona, which was something I hadn't even heard of. And there's a little bit, and now that more and more people are asking about it, there's now becoming more and more stories where people are now starting to tell their own family stories about how they got here. And so for me, it's really helping us understand kind of where we're at in a better light. And that a lot of times our history can be kind of slanted, and trying to get those other voices to talk about. When you talk about like downtown Phoenix, it was like you had the South Seas, which was probably the earliest bar in downtown Phoenix. You also had the 307. Around the corner from that in the I think the mid 70s was Cruisin' Central. And so really kind of right after Stonewall, there started to be an upcropping of a variety of bars across the valley, as I'm sure happened everywhere else. But then I think it's always interesting that you start having this crossover. You had like folks like Ray Bourbon, who at a time where, or even like Julian Elting, somebody who was famous for appearing in drag, but if they were caught on the street doing the same thing, they would be taken to jail, kicked out of town, ran out on a rail. And I think it's an interesting comparison when you start looking at kind of just that history of being in a screen or being in a bar was one thing, but now being able to live your life authentically out on the street was completely different. And so just kind of helping share those stories of people. We've also done a panel of kind of the entertainment community and the response to HIV/AIDS, which was really interesting in terms of so many performers were doing benefit shows, not just in bars, but also in people's backyards, trying to raise funds to support the community.
And this was when?
This would have been in the 80s, as AIDS was just kind of really hitting here.
So that, of course, predates your...
Oh, that predates mine. Well, I mean, but what was interesting was being involved with, we had the BJ Butt Archive. She was a pioneer lesbian here in the 70s that kind of was at the forefront of making sure that there was a voice. She had a newsletter called Sunday's Child. Without her, those first Pride events that happened in the 70s and 80s would not have happened. She had made an archive. And so at one point I had found storage for it at a library venue. And so being able to go through all these periodicals from the 70s pretty much to current day and seeing how the community had changed over the decades was quite interesting, and really trying to look at that vibrant community that was here in bars as well as elsewhere. And you also had a proliferation of house parties, because back when bars were being raided, people didn't want to go to those. So we know there were a handful of houses that were famous for having parties that you had to be pre-vetted. You couldn't just show up at the door and knock on it. You had to be invited by someone or come with someone who was known by the host to be able to get into the party.
Now I'm looking at your Hip Historian YouTube channel, and you've got a video there that is called That's Entertainment, Arizona LGBTQ History. Is that a video that you created, or did that come from somewhere else?
No, actually, that's a video that we created. Basically, it's a presentation that I put together just kind of looking at entertainment across the state. Because we had so many, I think probably one of the earliest performers I was able to find, like Rusty Warren, who was a female piano player, classically trained on the East Coast. She moved to Arizona to play in a piano bar. She wound up with 15 albums to her credit. Her humor was very pro-female. And her early hit song was called Knockers Up. And for that, she is now considered to be the birth mother of the sex revolution. She also did a song called Bounce Your Boobies, which, if you listen to Randy Rhoads, that's her intro, is Rusty's song.
Very cool. Well, we're going to splice in a little clip of that video to give people a taste, and then they can head over to your YouTube channel and actually watch the whole video, because it's almost an hour long. I mean, there's a lot of information in there, and maybe they'll get introduced to some of your hip historian videos there as well. So here's that little clip, and we'll be back in just a second.
Welcome to the show. Get ready to meet your host for the night, Arizona's very own hip historian himself, Sure.
And then when you fast forward, Ray Bourbon, who was really a drag queen who came out of kind of the late 20s, early 30s, and has several albums, and he traveled the country, was quite famous and quite well known. And so he graced several stages here in Arizona, including Kay Elledge, who had a bar called Kay's Happy Landing Buffet, which was one of the earliest lesbian bars, actually even one of the earliest gay bars that we can identify in Arizona. Back in the early 40s, her and her girlfriend Violet opened up this bar. And on one of his records, the back of it just lists all these places where he would perform. And Arizona pops up in several places. And what I thought was interesting was I didn't know why he kept going to Kay's Happy Landing. And then I discovered that Kay had been one of his musicians in his traveling band as he would perform. So they were good friends, and so he would always come and see Kay and perform at her little venue.
Now, people can obviously go to your hip historian profile on YouTube and see a whole variety of videos about Arizona history and learn all kinds of quirky things, and maybe brush up their Arizona trivia game for the next time they want to throw out some quirky little facts out there.
Also for social media, if on Facebook, we are AZ Gay History, Instagram as well.
Excellent. We'll put those links in the end of the video as well, so everybody can find you and learn more about Arizona gay history and about the hip historian.
And I know we're actually, and also it's like when we talk about LGBT history, we won an Emmy for a project we did with Cronkite. It was a SPA, which is a student Emmy, which I think is still pretty impressive. And that is for Nikolai Duralin, who was a Russian gentleman who moved from Russia to Chicago, got himself a good government job, 2 wives, 1 divorce, and tuberculosis. And so he moves to Arizona for his health, and that doesn't go well. He winds up passing away here. And as they're ready for burial, they discover that he was born a woman.
Oh, wow.
And his story it was across the planet from Bisbee to Australia, above the fold on the front page. And so he was buried here without a headstone. So we actually raised money pre-COVID and got him a headstone.
Very cool. And his name was Nikolai Duralin?
Yes. And so now it's like, and so through doing all of that, there is actually a book out about him, but it's all in Russian. So I have a copy, but I am unable to read it.
Wow. So you're going to have to brush up on your Russian now.
Oh, I would have to do more than brush up.
Well, maybe you can get somebody at the local university in the language department to kind of at least give you an overview of what's in there. And
well, one thing that's always kind of in my mind's eye is somebody who is looking to do like a PhD project that is also LGBTQ focused. It's like, well, you could do an English version, a translation of this book. So, I mean, that's been really, I think, the interesting thing of looking at Arizona. You also have the term Two-Spirit, which I don't know how widely that is used kind of outside of places that don't have a rich indigenous culture. But the fact that Two-Spirit is a relatively new term to describe centuries ago when people who were living in other outside of just male, female gender, they were actually kind of exalted for their talents. And so you would have someone who was now living as a woman that was considered to be an honor if they name your child. And so really those Two-Spirit people were really revered for their gifts.
Yeah, I am noticing more of that as I do my research. When I started this project, I was thinking of my start in the gay community, my first exposures to gay bars and things of that nature. And at that time, everything was gay. There was no even lesbian really identified. It was the gay community. It was the National Gay Task Force. It was, everything was gay. There were no LGBTQ and et cetera. And now every place seems to have a different preference. I'm seeing some that are just LGBT. I'm seeing LGBTQ. I'm seeing the 2S is showing up mostly, surprisingly, in Canada, and certain European countries are even starting the acronym 2S LGBTQ.
Oh, wow.
Like that is their starting point for identifying the queer community, or what we used to call the gay community. So 2S is getting a little bit more prominent. I think you're right. The indigenous population is where it, I think, got its name to begin with and was first identified that way.
Right. It came from the community, so it wasn't something that a label that someone else put on them. It was something they came up with themselves.
Right. And I still see that in a lot of people I've met that are of indigenous extraction somehow, have used that term as well. But it's gotten to the point now where it's all just, whatever label. I still use gay because that's the term that was in my head, 50 years ago.
Right.
So I'm going to be stuck with that in my head for a while, but
right.
Whatever it is.
Right. And as a librarian, it was interesting because so librarians within, it was at that point, it was the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual Roundtable was the first professional organization in the country that was LGBTQ centric.
Right.
And I mean, there were some pioneer folks that were involved with that. And so now I think it is now called the Rainbow Coalition. I was looking something up for somebody and I was like, oh, they're no longer using LGBTQ or GLBT.
Yeah, I wish they could just somehow, we could agree on a common term, because as you mentioned, as your background as a librarian, it's not only librarians, it's any kind of researcher. If one place uses LGBT and the next one uses 2SQ and the next one uses queer and the next one uses gay, it complicates the research process because you have more terms that you have to search for and then kind of collate and cross-reference. So it would be nice if we had a single term that constantly embraced the entire community, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. So
I'm going to say, right. I mean, it's interesting because I think you have the word queer that's now starting to pop up in more and more places as the umbrella term. But as you and I know, it's like there are communities that still view that word as very much as hate speech.
Right.
And so that's why the History Project is the LGBT plus.
But I have noticed too, I have a list on my website. I have a page on my website that is called Archives. And on that page, I list as many online archives as I could find from mostly the US, and separate them state by state. And then I also have some national ones listed in there. And surprisingly, including the one right where you are sitting right now, in Arizona, are using the word queer. So the Arizona LGBTQ archival project is known as Arizona Queer Archive.
So that is U of A. So that is University of Arizona. ASU, the Arizona State University, has the BJ Budd Archive.
Well, yeah, some of them have names of just people, but I've noticed that a number of them, Los Angeles has a Queer Maps project.
Right, and really, queer was I think a term that the academia community said, hey, here's one term that means everybody.
Right.
But they've also offended so many folks because of that.
Yeah, and even some of the international ones have used queer, and it's embraced by them. But it is what it is.
Right, and so and that's part of the issue of when you go to do the research. I mean, it's like with the Arizona Historical Society a couple years ago, actually pre-COVID, we did a trans timeline of Arizona history, which was kind of fascinating. And so really going back, and the term that was the most prevalent at that point was female impersonator.
For someone who is trans?
Someone who was dressing up in women's clothing. And so we don't know, because of how it was listed, it was like there was one guy in Globe, Arizona, that we found two different articles talking about how he was caught dressed as a woman right down to his undergarments. And one, the headline was, Globe has a freak. The other one was like, oh, there's this gentleman who was caught wearing women's clothing. So it's kind of even, and so when you start looking at just the mainstream press, it's like you really had these various disparaging comments, or even trying to find things that are just trying to find those stories. And so we don't know much about this young man. I've tried then searching for him through like Ancestry.com, trying to figure out, well, where did he wind up, and not being able to find him. So I'm assuming that the name he gave and that appears on these articles is probably not even his real name.
Right.
So.
And that was definitely the case in a lot of places. There's a lot of stories out there. I know one that I just spoke with Bryce Smith the other day when I was doing a segment on Milwaukee, and there was a tavern in Milwaukee called Blunt's, which was opened in 1893 by the Blunt family, and their son, who was very well known in the community, their son, they later found out it was an adopted son to this Blunt family. It was later discovered that the son was actually born a woman and presented himself as a male the whole time, and nobody knew.
Wow.
Until he got busted for something and went to jail, and somehow it came out. But so, that was in the 1890s. So we see that, but it's hard to track down, like you said, because they changed names. I think his original name was Anna something, so you have a hard time finding all this because it's not going to appear. Nobody was particularly interested in documenting anything of queer history back then, other than things that showed it off in a bad light. So if they could portray you as perverts or, some kind of sexual offender of some sort or whatever, they would. And you'd see it in the police records, the things of that nature, court records. But
right. And that's one of the things that really has kind of, with now the ability to keyword search, we're able to find things that in the past would have taken decades to find this one article. But now you can bring it up in minutes just by searching an old newspaper through keyword searching.
And there are more and more university affiliated academic research projects and archival projects around the country that focus on all different aspects of gay culture, queer culture, whatever you want to call it. And I think I stumbled across one in the state of New Jersey. Somebody actually created a database that you can search for all of the alcoholic beverage establishments that were ever issued citations or had their licenses revoked or suspended for things related to gay. So you can go to the state of New Jersey and find out, basically track down a lot of bars that were LGBT establishments in the 40s and 50s by virtue of their criminal activity. The fact that they were busted for serving gay people tells you that they were a gathering place for gay people.
Right.
So it's interesting how much more information we can find now, and I hope that continues. I hope there are more people like you that are delving into all aspects of history and publishing it in video form or archival databases or whatever, so that we can continue to build on this, and that generations after us will have just a multitude of resources for all this information.
Right. I mean, one thing is that it's like, so I'm supposed to be working on Arcadia book about LGBTQ history in Phoenix. Kind of started during COVID. And so that slowed the process down. And part of that is it's going to be a very photo heavy book. And if I was going to do the book on white men and gay bars in the 80s, I could have the book done tomorrow. But trying to find, though, I mean, it's like, I think I've worked for like almost like a year and a half to find a photo of a gay black man in the 50s. And I think I have. So I have to find some time the next month or two to get out to Apache Junction to see if indeed it is this one guy I'm looking for.
I completely understand. I get lambasted sometimes by people. I had somebody on my GayBarchives group page the other day, a female, who basically accused me of kicking the women to the curb and focusing on men's bars. And I explained to her, I said, that is not at all my intent. I said, I've done 90 interviews. I have reached out to probably as many women as I have men, but frequently they don't want to tell their stories, or they just don't want to be, they don't have a story to tell. To find the bars is almost impossible, because so many of the lesbian bars and the bars for people of color were underground operations. It was the men's bars that advertised in Damerons, that advertised in the local magazines, that were the big, in your face places. And so it's just very difficult to find the information. It's not that we don't want to talk about them. It's that they are almost impossible to find in many cases. And as you know now, there's only a dozen lesbian bars in the entire country.
And one of those is right here in Phoenix.
Yes, it is.
Boycott.
And it's amazing, because there are still hundreds, thousands of gay bars across the country that are still operating. But lesbian bars, there's only a dozen. So obviously it's harder to find the information.
But I also think it's kind of like, it's been interesting talking to some of the younger folks that, sometimes gay bars have become almost entertainment for bachelorette parties, people just dropping in. And so it's like, I've actually had younger friends saying, I wish we really had more exclusive queer spaces where we can go in half drag, we can go be a little experimental without being judged by the outside society. So I think it's been kind of interesting that folks are kind of looking for almost something else besides more of a gay mainstream bar, but now looking for more of a niche.
Yeah, I totally see that. And I've seen that in a number of clubs around the country that have identified themselves more as queer spaces. And they blatantly post on there. Like I've seen one bar that I did a little piece on. They had a sign at the door that said, flagrant heterosexual activity will not be tolerated. So they basically tell people, you're welcome to come here, anybody. We don't care who you sleep with. You can come in the bar, but you have to respect our patrons and our community, the queer community. And if you don't respect them, then you're not staying. So I think that's more the attitude these days, is that, the younger people want to be able to, do whatever. They want to be able to put on lipstick and high heels and then dress as a man anyway, or whatever. They don't want to be put in a slot.
Right.
So, but I'm so grateful for people like you who have taken the time to record some of this history and to share it online. And I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today and kind of talk a little bit about some of the history of the gay bars in Indiana, in New York City, and in Arizona. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I love chatting about history. I mean, it gives us a different window into so many different locations.
And I will definitely put the links up at the end for your various online presences. And I will also invite you to go to our Facebook group, which is called GayBarchives. I created that Facebook group a little over a year ago. We have about 5,500 active members.
Wow.
And you are welcome to post links to your YouTube videos about gay history, or talk about it, or ask questions. If you're trying to track something down, say, hey, who knows about this bar in Phoenix that was around in 1962? All I know is that it was called,
right,
Toodaloo's. And you'll get some feedback, but it's a great way to kind of get people actively involved, and you will get feedback and you will find things that you did not know. I certainly have learned a lot through that group as well.
That's great.
You're welcome to use it and promote your own adventures and projects.
Very good. Yeah, we just got a grant from the Office of Arts and Culture with the City of Phoenix to really try to do some virtual storytelling. And so we'll be starting that up in the fall, of just trying to get people to share some of that history that may not show up in print.
Well, Go to the GayBarchives group on
I will
Facebook.
indeed use that as a way to push it out there so we can get more of those stories.
Absolutely. And you certainly will. I recently had, not too long ago, had an article published in a magazine about the GayBarchives project. And the photographs that were used in that article all came from members of the GayBarchives group who had posted pictures of themselves as a bartender on Turnabout Day in 1981 at the Copa in Key West or whatever. And these are pictures that nobody would have found had it not been for the group. I asked their permission, they gave it to me, and I sent them off to the magazine and they used them. So it's kind of cool when you find that kind of stuff. And, it's kind of like looking at somebody else's scrapbook and reliving their memories. And you're welcome to do that with our group. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I also want to give a plug out to one of my favorite resources, and I hope I get it right. It is the queermusicheritage.com. Sometimes I throw the word music, but I think it's actually heritage. And it really is looking at kind of the history of queer music, which the gentleman's put that together. I mean, it's a quite comprehensive source. And I found ads for bars across the country there.
And where is this based in any particular city or?
He is, I think he's out of San Francisco. But it covers the entire country. I mean, I found things out of Michigan. That was the Folio Fools, who were a group of early pantomimers, meaning they were lip syncing before lip syncing was a thing.
I believe you are correct. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, some time ago, maybe a year ago, somewhere around there, I interviewed him.
Oh, nice.
Because it's Jack Curtis Dabowski, and he also has a project he worked on called Submerged Queer Spaces.
Ah, okay.
And, which is San Francisco based. It's pictures of spaces from San Francisco's gay history, kind of organized by neighborhood. And that was episode 14. So we're talking about 76 episodes ago.
Wow.
But Jack Curtis Dabowski, and yes, I believe you're correct that he did the Queer Heritage Project as well. So thank you for mentioning that.
Oh yeah, I mean, I found that source. I found folks in Arizona's history that I didn't know existed. So
yeah, and I will add that to my archives page so other people can find it. If you go to my archives page now, there's over 100 LGBTQ archive websites listed on that page and linked on there. So if you're looking for information for your own projects, you can go there and find all these different resources around the country.
Oh, very cool.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
And you as well.
Thank you so much.
That concludes another episode of the GayBarchives Show. For more information about this episode or to find more episodes, visit GayBarchives.com.